5 guests would later swear, under oath and by the fire, that they alone had held the flask last, and 4 of them were lying without knowing it. Lord Julian Crane collapsed on the polished parquet floor of the receiving line before the grandfather clock had even finished chiming the quarter hour. The silver hip flask clattered from his hand, spilling a dark, bitter-smelling amber pool that stained the hem of his fiancée's white silk gown. He did not speak. He merely looked up at the vaulted ceiling of the great hall with an expression of profound, almost apologetic surprise, before his eyes rolled back. By the end of tonight's story, you will have heard this evening 5 different ways, and only one of them is true. Hello friends, I'm Jack, coming to you from right here in Ohio, and welcome back to Midnight Pages. Settle in by the fire, draw the curtains tight against the cold, and let me ask you something: how much do you trust your own memory of an ordinary evening? If I asked you who handed you your coat, or which hand they used, would you swear to it? Drop me a line in the comments, because tonight's story is about the terrifying fragility of what we think we know. Now settle in. Let me take you to the Ashdown Hunt Ball. Chapter 1: The Gathering at Ashdown. The Ashdown Hunt Ball had been held in the great hall of Ashdown Manor on the 2nd Saturday of November for 84 years. It was an event characterized less by celebration than by a grim, collective determination to uphold standards that no longer entirely made sense. The manor itself, a sprawling Elizabethan pile of cold stone and draughty corridors, belonged to the Vance family, who had occupied it since the days when possessing such a house meant possessing wealth, rather than merely possessing a roof that required constant, ruinously expensive repair. Miss Jane Marple, arriving in a hired car from the station, felt the chill of the place immediately. She had been invited by the host, Sir Reginald Vance, on the strength of a tenuous connection. Sir Reginald's late wife had once served on a missionary society committee with Miss Marple, and Sir Reginald, finding himself short of respectable older women to balance the dinner tables, had extended an invitation that was as much a summons as a courtesy. Miss Marple, who knew a great deal about the social utility of elderly spinsters, had accepted. She wore a dress of slightly faded black lace, carried her knitting in a worn tapestry bag, and gave every appearance of being entirely absorbed in the problem of a dropped stitch. In truth, she was absorbing everything. The great hall was illuminated by 3 massive crystal chandeliers, though the light they cast seemed only to emphasize the shadows pooling in the corners. The air smelled of wood smoke, damp wool, expensive perfume, and the faint, metallic tang of old anxieties. The local gentry had turned out in force, a collection of ruddy-faced men in evening dress and women wearing jewels that spent most of the year in bank vaults. Among them moved the members of the Vance household, each carrying their own particular atmosphere of strain. There was Eleanor Vance, Sir Reginald's daughter, a woman of 32 who looked both older and younger than her years. She had a sharp, intelligent face, but her eyes were restless, darting constantly toward the doors, and she had a habit of adjusting her left pearl earring, touching it every few minutes as though reassuring herself it was still there. Miss Marple watched her and thought of a bird trapped in a conservatory, exhausting itself by flying against glass it could not see. Then there was Arthur Vance, Sir Reginald's nephew. He was a handsome man in a careless, slightly frayed sort of way, the kind of man who always seems to have just returned from a holiday he could not afford. As he moved through the crowd, laughing a little too loudly, he kept his right hand thrust deep into his trouser pocket, jingling his coins with a rhythmic, nervous energy. Miss Marple knew the type well. In St. Mary Mead, there had been a young man named Tommy Lipton who jingled his coins in exactly the same way whenever the baker asked to settle the month's account. Tommy had eventually borrowed from the wrong sort of people and vanished to South America. Arthur Vance, Miss Marple suspected, had not yet found a South America to run to. Standing near the fireplace, attempting to look as though he owned it, was Captain Hugh Dacre. He was the master of the rival Westbridge hunt, a man with a booming voice, a florid complexion, and a thick, bristling mustache that he stroked with the knuckle of his index finger whenever he was contradicted. He was ostensibly a guest, but he watched the room with the assessing, proprietary glare of a bailiff tallying assets. Moving silently among them was Bates, the elderly butler. He had been at Ashdown for 50 years, his spine curving with the weight of other people's secrets. He stood near the entrance to the drawing-room, his hands clasped so tightly behind his back that his knuckles were white. Before he spoke, he invariably gave a small, dry cough, a sound that was less clearing his throat than buying a fraction of a second to arrange his features into professional blankness. And finally, there was the guest of honor, the man for whom the evening's receiving line was primarily intended, Lord Julian Crane, and his fiancée, Lady Beatrice. Lord Julian was a man who had made a career of being effortlessly superior. He was wealthy, titled, and possessed of a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He had the kind of polished, impenetrable surface that made other people feel immediately inadequate. Lady Beatrice, by contrast, seemed almost fragile. She was beautiful, pale, and dressed in a gown of white silk that rustled like dry leaves when she walked. She wore elbow-length white gloves and a sapphire engagement ring so large it looked heavy on her slender finger. She twisted the ring constantly, her thumb rubbing the underside of the band as though trying to rub away a stain. Miss Marple, observing from a chair near the potted palms, noted all of this. She saw the way Eleanor Vance avoided looking at Lord Julian. She saw the way Arthur Vance's coin jingling stopped abruptly whenever Lady Beatrice walked past. She saw the way Bates the butler watched Captain Dacre. It was, Miss Marple thought, a very interesting room. Beneath the surface respectability, beneath the polite murmurs and the clinking of glasses, something dark and heavy was moving, like a current beneath the ice of a frozen pond. Chapter 2: The Receiving Line. The formal receiving line was a tradition Sir Reginald insisted upon, much to the exhaustion of his guests. It formed at precisely 9 o'clock in the corridor leading from the great hall to the dining room. Sir Reginald stood at the head, followed by Eleanor, Arthur, Lord Julian, Lady Beatrice, and Captain Dacre. It was during this tedious, highly structured social ritual that the silver hip flask made its appearance. The flask was an antique, heavy silver with a captive top, the sort of hinge that requires one to twist the cap and tilt it back, preventing it from being lost. It belonged to Arthur Vance, or so Miss Marple overheard him claim loudly to Captain Dacre. It was filled with a particularly fine, peaty single malt Scotch, intended, Arthur said, to ward off the chill of the corridor. Because of the strictness of the line, the guests passing through were merely shaking hands and murmuring pleasantries. But among the members of the receiving line itself, standing shoulder to shoulder for nearly 40 minutes, the flask was passed quietly from hand to hand, a small, illicit comfort against the draught. Miss Marple, who had already gone through the line and taken up a position in the dining room with an excellent view of the corridor, watched the silver catch the light as it moved. It was a subtle choreography. A hand reaching out behind a back. A quick swallow while turning to greet a local magistrate. A discreet transfer under the cover of a dropped handkerchief. She saw Eleanor Vance hold it. She saw Arthur jingle his coins and take it back. She saw Captain Dacre stroke his mustache, take the flask, and tilt his head back. She saw Bates, managing the flow of guests, briefly take the flask from a hand she couldn't quite see and place it on a side table, only for it to be picked up again a moment later. And she saw Lady Beatrice, her white silk gloves gleaming, holding the silver flask before passing it down the line. It was a perfectly ordinary, rather mundane sequence of events. A group of people sharing a drink to pass the time. Until the grandfather clock in the great hall began to chime the quarter hour. Chapter 3: The Collapse. The chime was a deep, resonant sound that echoed through the stone corridors. At the first stroke, Lord Julian Crane turned from shaking the hand of the vicar's wife. He reached out and took the silver flask from the person standing to his right. Miss Marple, whose eyesight was excellent for her age, saw him twist the captive top with his right hand. He raised the flask to his lips. He took a long, deep swallow. At the third stroke of the clock, Lord Julian lowered the flask. He did not hand it to the next person. He stood very still. He looked down at his own hand, holding the silver, as if he did not quite understand what it was. Then he looked up, his eyes wide, locking onto something or someone in the line. His mouth opened, but the sound that came out was a wet, choking gasp. He pitched forward. He did not stumble, he simply collapsed, a sudden loss of all structural integrity, falling heavily onto the polished parquet floor. The silver flask clattered loudly, rolling in a slow arc, spilling the amber liquid across the floorboards. The puddle seeped quickly toward Lady Beatrice, staining the hem of her white silk gown. For a single, suspended second, no one moved. The tableau held, Eleanor clutching her pearl earring, Arthur's hand frozen in his pocket, Dacre's knuckle against his mustache, Beatrice twisting her ring, Bates rigid by the door. Then, chaos. Lady Beatrice screamed, a high, thin sound that cut through the murmur of the crowd. Guests surged forward, then recoiled. Arthur dropped to his knees beside Lord Julian, his hands hovering uselessly over the man's chest. Captain Dacre shouted for a doctor. Eleanor Vance turned her face to the wall and pressed her hands to her mouth. Miss Marple did not run forward. She remained in her chair, her knitting needles perfectly still in her lap. She looked at Lord Julian Crane, whose skin was rapidly taking on a horrifying, mottled bluish hue. She looked at the silver flask, lying on its side. And then, methodically, she looked at the 5 people who had stood nearest to him. She did not look for grief. She looked for the absence of surprise. And she noted, with the same quiet precision she used to count her knitting stitches, that while 4 of the people in the receiving line looked shocked, horrified, or panicked, one of them looked only deeply, profoundly relieved. Chapter 4: The Arrival of Authority. Dr. Henry Clitheroe, the local physician who had been enjoying a plate of roast beef in the dining room, pushed his way through the crowd. He was a small, round man who usually dealt with gout and winter colds. He dropped beside Lord Julian, checked his pulse, lifted an eyelid, and then sat back on his heels, his face pale. "He's gone," Dr. Clitheroe said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden, dreadful silence. "Heart failure. Or something else." He sniffed the air near Lord Julian's mouth, then looked sharply at the spilled liquid from the flask. "I need the police. Now. No one is to touch that flask." Inspector Ronald Davies arrived 20 minutes later from the county constabulary. He was a tall, weary-looking man who wore his authority like a damp overcoat. He brought with him a sergeant, a notebook, and a deep-seated resentment for the upper classes. He immediately ordered the doors locked and the guests herded into the drawing-room. The body was covered with a tablecloth. The flask was carefully collected in a glass jar. "Cyanide," the inspector muttered to the doctor, leaning over the puddle on the floor. "Smells like bitter almonds." "Not cyanide," Dr. Clitheroe corrected softly. "Aconite, I suspect." "Wolfsbane. Fast-acting. Causes a tingling in the mouth, then paralysis of the heart. The bitter smell is the Scotch masking the root extract." Someone dosed the flask. Inspector Davies stood up, his eyes sweeping the room. "Who owned the flask?" "I did," Arthur Vance said. He stepped forward, his face the color of old parchment. He was not jingling his coins now. "But I didn't dose it. We were all drinking from it." "All of you?" Davies asked. "The receiving line," Eleanor said, her voice trembling. She was still touching her earring. "We passed it down the line." Davies opened his notebook. "Who had it last? Who handed it to Lord Julian?" This, Miss Marple knew, was the crucial question. She leaned forward slightly in her chair. "I did," said Lady Beatrice, her voice barely a whisper. "I handed it to him." "No, you didn't," Captain Dacre interrupted, his booming voice echoing in the hall. "I saw you take it from him, not the other way around." Bates handed it to him. Bates the butler coughed his dry cough. "Begging your pardon, sir. I did not touch the flask after it was retrieved from the side table." Mr. Arthur handed it to his lordship. "Are you mad?" Arthur snapped. "I gave it to Eleanor." Eleanor looked at her brother, her eyes wide. "Arthur, you didn't. You gave it to Captain Dacre." Inspector Davies closed his notebook with a snap. He looked at the 5 of them. 5 people. 5 different accounts of a 10-minute window. "Right," Davies said heavily. "I'll see you all in the library. One at a time." Miss Marple, gathering her knitting, stood up. She had a feeling it was going to be a very long night. In St. Mary Mead, when the butcher's accounts didn't balance, it was usually because 3 different people were lying to cover for a 4th who hadn't asked them to. Here, she suspected, the lying was far more complicated, and far more desperate. She intended to listen to every word. Chapter 5: The Daughter's Account. The library of Ashdown Manor was a room designed to intimidate, built in an era when the sheer volume of unread books was considered a testament to a family's moral character. Lined from the polished oak floor to the soaring plasterwork ceiling with volumes that had not been cracked open in 3 generations, the room smelled faintly of cracked leather bindings, beeswax polish, and the pervasive, creeping damp that was the manor's true inheritance. Inspector Davies sat behind the massive, claw-footed desk, looking distinctly uncomfortable, as though he expected the ancestral portraits lining the upper gallery to demand his credentials. Miss Marple sat in a high-backed leather chair by the dying fire, entirely unobtrusive, her knitting needles clicking with a soft, steady, hypnotic rhythm. The inspector had initially tried to remove her, muttering about official police business, but Sir Reginald, profoundly shaken by the scandalous reality of a corpse in his hallway, had insisted on her presence. A comforting female influence, Sir Reginald had called her, a description Miss Marple accepted with a mild, unreadable smile that hid a mind already sifting through the evening's debris. Eleanor Vance was the first to be summoned. She entered the room like a woman walking to the guillotine, but determined not to let the executioner see her tremble. She sat rigidly in the chair opposite the desk, her posture agonizingly straight. Her fingers returned again and again to her left pearl earring, twisting it, checking its security with a frantic, repetitive motion that spoke of an anxiety deeper than mere shock. "Now, Miss Vance," Inspector Davies began, his tone a careful mixture of deference to her class and the necessary suspicion of his profession. "You were standing next to your father at the head of the receiving line. I need you to tell me exactly what you saw. Every detail, no matter how trivial it might seem." Eleanor took a long, unsteady breath, her gaze fixing resolutely on the heavy brass inkwell on the desk, avoiding the inspector's eyes. "It was tedious, Inspector. You know how these archaic things are. Endless shaking of hands, repeating the same meaningless pleasantries to people one hasn't seen in a year and has no desire to see for another. The corridor is dreadfully draughty." Arthur brought the flask out about 20 minutes into the ordeal. He muttered something about needing to be fortified against the cold and the county gossips. I saw him take a long drink, and then he offered it to me. "And did you drink from it?" Davies pressed, his pen hovering over his notebook. "Just a sip. I barely let it touch my lips. It was very strong, a harsh single malt that burned the throat. I am not accustomed to drinking spirits in a draughty hallway." "And then what did you do with it?" "I handed it back to Arthur," she said firmly, her voice gaining a sudden, defensive edge. "He was standing immediately to my right. He took it and put it deep into his trouser pocket for a few minutes. Then, when old Mrs. Higgins came through the line, she is the vicar's mother-in-law, Inspector, and she talks forever about her rheumatics and her prize-winning marrows. You see," Arthur grew restless. He took the flask out again. "But he didn't drink. I watched him. He passed it behind his back to Captain Dacre." "You are absolutely certain of this?" Davies asked, making a thick, dark line in his notebook. "Arthur says he handed the flask to you, and that you kept it." "Arthur is lying," Eleanor said quickly, her voice sharp and brittle, like breaking glass. "Or he is confused by the shock. He passed it to Captain Dacre. I saw it happen. I saw the captain take it with his left hand. He had a crystal glass of sherry in his right hand, resting loosely on the edge of the side table behind us. He drank from the flask, wiped his mustache, and then the grandfather clock began to chime the quarter hour. And Julian fell. Did you see Captain Dacre hand it to Lord Julian?" Eleanor hesitated. For a long, painful moment, her fingers left the pearl earring and gripped the carved wooden arms of the chair so tightly her knuckles whitened. "No. I was looking at Mrs. Higgins. I had to pretend to listen to her complaint about the damp. But I know Arthur didn't have the flask when Julian drank. And I know absolutely that I didn't have it." Miss Marple paused in her knitting. The sudden silence of the needles drew the room's attention more effectively than a shout. "Forgive me, Miss Vance," she murmured, her voice soft, hesitant, and entirely non-threatening, like a bird fluttering against a window pane. "You said Captain Dacre wiped his mustache after drinking from the flask. Did he use a handkerchief?" Eleanor looked startled, almost affronted, to be addressed by the old woman in the corner. "No. He just used his knuckle. The side of his index finger. He always does that." It's a rather coarse habit of his. I see. Thank you, my dear. I only ask because I find men are so often careless with their handkerchiefs, especially when they are drinking. My nephew Raymond, the writer, is terrible about it. Always leaving them crumpled in pockets with ink stains. Miss Marple smiled vaguely and resumed her knitting, her eyes on the grey wool. Davies frowned heavily at the interruption, clearly annoyed by the digression, but he pressed on. Miss Vance, returning to the victim. Were you acquainted with Lord Julian before his engagement to Lady Beatrice? The shift in Eleanor's posture was microscopic, a sudden stiffening of the spine, a subtle drawing back. To Davies, it meant nothing. But to Miss Marple, who had spent decades observing the precise angle at which guilt holds its shoulders, it was as loud as a shout in an empty church. We moved in the same social circles, Eleanor said carefully, her words measured and exact. He visited Ashdown a few years ago for the autumn shooting party. My father hosted him. And nothing more? No personal correspondence? No private disagreements? Nothing that concerns his death, she snapped, a flash of genuine anger breaking through her control. Davies let the silence stretch, a heavy, oppressive quiet filled only by the ticking of the mantel clock and the crackle of the fire. It was a good policeman's trick, designed to make the witness rush to fill the void, but Eleanor outlasted him. She stood up, her jaw set. If that is all, Inspector, I should like to go to my room. I have a terrible headache. Oh, undoubtedly, Miss Marple agreed cheerfully, looping the wool over her needle. But whether she is hiding a murder, or merely a broken heart and a desperate desire to protect someone, remains to be seen. You notice, Inspector, she was quite certain about the captain's left hand taking the flask. A very specific, precise detail for someone who claimed to be completely absorbed in looking at Mrs. Higgins. Davies grunted, making another note, just as the library door was thrown open. Chapter 6: The Nephew's Account. Arthur Vance did not enter the library so much as he was propelled into it by his own nervous energy. He practically threw himself into the leather chair, crossing and uncrossing his long legs. He did not look at the inspector, nor did he acknowledge Miss Marple. He stared fixedly into the fire, his handsome, somewhat frayed face drawn tight with anxiety. His right hand was plunged deep into his trouser pocket, and the familiar jingle of coins, a rapid, rhythmic chinking of silver and copper, filled the quiet room like a nervous heartbeat. "It's madness," Arthur said, the words spilling out before Davies could even open his notebook. "Absolute, terrifying madness. Someone poisoned my flask. My personal flask. They could have killed me. They could have killed Eleanor, or my uncle. They could have killed any of us standing in that line. But they didn't, Mr. Vance," Davies said dryly, leaning back in his chair and studying the younger man. "They killed Lord Julian Crane. Now, I need you to walk me through the sequence of events. You brought the flask to the receiving line." "Yes." "A necessity, I assure you," Arthur insisted, his voice rising. "Standing in that drafty corridor for an hour shaking hands with people who despise you is enough to drive anyone to drink. I took a pull early on to steady my nerves, then I offered it to Eleanor. She had a tiny sip. Barely touched it. And then? What happened to the flask?" "She kept it," Arthur said instantly, the words coming too fast, too rehearsed. "She put it down on the mahogany side table behind us, trying to hide it behind that massive vase of lilies. She didn't want my father to see it, he hates us drinking in public. She left it there. 10 minutes later, while I was greeting the magistrate, I looked over and saw Bates take it. Davies looked up, his eyebrows raised. The butler? You saw Bates the butler take the flask? Yes. I saw it with my own eyes. He picked it up from behind the vase. I assumed he was going to take it away to the pantry, tidy it up, pour it out perhaps. He's an absolute stickler for that sort of thing, always policing our behavior. But he didn't take it away. He held it down by his side, concealed against his leg, hidden in the folds of his coat tails. Then he moved down the line toward Beatrice and Julian. He was hovering behind them. That's the last I saw of the flask until Julian dropped it and died on the floor. This is very interesting, Mr. Vance, Davies said, tapping his pen. Because your sister claims you took the flask back from her, held it in your pocket, and then passed it behind your back to Captain Dacre. Arthur's laugh was short, harsh, and entirely devoid of humor. Eleanor is protecting Dacre. She always has, ever since they were children. Look, Inspector, I don't know who passed the flask to Julian at the very end. I only know I didn't have it. If anyone dosed the scotch with poison, they did it when it was sitting unattended behind that vase of lilies. Miss Marple, who had been knitting in silence, suddenly dropped a ball of grey wool. It rolled across the Persian carpet, coming to a halt near Arthur's foot. With a sigh of profound annoyance, Arthur pulled his hand from his pocket to retrieve it, the jingling of coins ceasing abruptly. "Thank you, Mr. Vance," Miss Marple said gently, taking the wool from his hand with a soft smile. "You are very kind to an old woman. Tell me, do you happen to know what time the evening post arrives here at Ashdown Manor?" Arthur stared at her, utterly bewildered, as if she had just asked him the price of cheese on the moon. "The post? Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, usually." "Why on earth does that matter?" "No reason, really," Miss Marple murmured, turning her attention back to her needles. "I merely noticed earlier this evening, before the ball began, that you seemed rather distressed by a letter you were reading in the entrance hall. A blue envelope, I believe? One of those nasty little windowed envelopes they use in London for demanding money. The sort that always seem to arrive at the worst possible moment." Arthur went perfectly still. The last vestiges of color drained from his face, leaving his skin looking sickly and pale in the flickering firelight. He looked from Miss Marple to the inspector, his eyes wide with a sudden, dawning terror. He realized in that moment that his carefully guarded secret, his financial desperation, was laid bare. "I have debts," he said thickly, his voice barely a whisper. "Everyone in our circle knows that. The estate is crumbling, my allowance is a joke. But I didn't kill Julian Crane. Did Lord Julian hold any of your debts, Mr. Vance?" Davies asked, leaning forward, his voice suddenly sharp and alert, smelling blood in the water. "Did you owe him money?" "No," Arthur said. But the word was hollow, echoing with unspoken anxieties. He stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair. "I've told you what I saw." Bates took the flask. "Ask him. Ask the butler." He practically fled the room, leaving the door standing open behind him. Miss Marple watched the empty doorway for a moment. In St. Mary Mead, she observed to her knitting, her voice conversational and mild, there was a young man named Arthur Carmody who owed the bank a great deal of money. He told everyone the bank manager was his dearest, closest friend, right up until the day he tried to burn the bank down to destroy the ledgers. Debt makes people do very foolish, desperate things, Inspector. It backs them into corners. But it rarely makes them creative. Poisoning a communal flask in a crowded room is a very creative, highly calculated act. It requires a certain coldness. The heavy, aggressive tread of boots in the hallway signaled that their next interview was already arriving. Chapter 7: The Rival's Account. Captain Hugh Dacre took up entirely too much space in the library, filling the room with the scent of bay rum, cigar smoke, and aggressive masculine confidence. He did not sit. He stood by the fireplace, resting a heavy arm on the mantelpiece, projecting an air of military authority and landed gentry entitlement that he clearly felt Inspector Davies lacked. He repeatedly stroked his bristling, reddish-brown mustache with the knuckle of his index finger, a gesture that seemed designed to draw attention to his own physical solidity and calm amidst the crisis. A tragedy, of course, Dacre boomed, though his voice sounded remarkably cheerful, almost robust, for a man discussing a murder. Crane was a decent enough fellow, I suppose, if you like that sort of polished London type. A bit soft for the hunt, though. The man didn't know a fetlock from a forelock, and he rode like a sack of potatoes. Still, one doesn't like to see a man drop dead in his evening clothes. Let us focus on the flask, Captain Dacre, Davies said, deliberately keeping his voice flat and unimpressed by the performance. Eleanor Vance claims her brother Arthur passed the silver flask to you behind his back. Dacre scoffed, a loud, dismissive sound that rattled the teacups on the side table. Nonsense. Absolute fabrication. The boy was holding onto his precious flask like a lifeline in a storm. He wouldn't part with it for love nor money. I didn't touch the blasted thing. Wouldn't drink Arthur's cheap, watered-down Scotch anyway, not if you paid me. No, I had a glass of very fine Amontillado sherry. Brought it with me from the drawing-room specifically because I know what Sir Reginald serves. Then who did you see holding the flask? Davies pressed. Dacre leaned forward, dropping his voice into a conspiratorial, rumbling whisper that carried perfectly to Miss Marple's corner. I'll tell you exactly what I saw, Inspector. I saw the girl take it. Lady Beatrice. From whom did she take it? From Bates, the old butler. He was hovering behind her, clearing glasses or some such domestic nonsense. He had the flask. I saw the silver gleam in his hand. He slipped it into her hand, her left hand, mark you. She took it quickly, furtively, and hid it in the folds of that voluminous white silk skirt she was wearing. A moment later, Crane turned to her, asked her something, complained about the draught, probably, and she handed the flask to him. He drank, and down he went like a felled oak. You are telling me Lady Beatrice gave him the poisoned flask? Davies repeated, skepticism heavy and obvious in his voice. Her own fiancé? The man she was set to marry in a month. Women, Dacre said sagely, stroking his mustache again and shaking his head. Unpredictable, treacherous creatures, Inspector. Crane was a very wealthy man. Perhaps she found someone else she liked better, a man with a bit more blood in his veins, but still wanted the Crane money. It wouldn't be the first time a woman poisoned her way out of an engagement. Miss Marple cleared her throat softly. The sound was so gentle it was barely audible, yet it instantly commanded the room. "Captain Dacre," she murmured, looking up from her knitting with wide, innocent blue eyes. "You said you had a glass of sherry. Which hand were you holding it in?" Dacre blinked down at her, momentarily confused by the domestic interrogation. "My right hand, of course. One holds one's glass in one's right hand." "Of course one does," Miss Marple smiled gently. "And you say you saw Bates slip the flask into Lady Beatrice's left hand." "But Lady Beatrice was standing to Lord Julian's right in the receiving line, was she not?" Dacre frowned, mentally arranging the line of people in his head. "Yes. She was on his right. Next to me." "Then if she took the flask in her left hand, which was furthest from Lord Julian, she would have had to reach awkwardly across her own body to hand it to him, or switch it to her right hand." "Did you see her switch hands, Captain?" "I don't recall. It all happened very quickly. The clock was chiming, people were talking. The confident bluster was fading rapidly, replaced by a defensive edge. Naturally, Miss Marple soothed, her voice like warm milk. Memory is such a tricky, fluid thing. Especially when one is trying to remember things that perhaps did not happen exactly as one wishes they had, or when one is trying very hard to fit a narrative to a predetermined conclusion." Dacre flushed an angry, mottled red. "Are you calling me a liar, madam?" "I am an officer and a gentleman." "I am merely observing," Miss Marple said, picking up a dropped stitch with practiced ease, "that the lighting in that corridor was quite poor, heavily shadowed by the tapestries, and you were standing at the far end of the line. It would be very easy to mistake a gleam of a silver tray for a silver flask. Or, perhaps, to see exactly what you wanted to see, in order to cast blame elsewhere." After Dacre had stormed out of the library, slamming the door so hard the dust motes danced in the firelight, Davies rubbed his temples in frustration. "He's lying to implicate the girl. It's obvious. But why? What does he gain?" "Perhaps because Captain Dacre's own estate borders the Crane lands," Miss Marple suggested mildly, holding her knitting up to check the pattern. "And there has been a bitter, deeply expensive dispute over water rights for 3 generations. A dispute Lord Julian was threatening to take to the High Court in London next month. If Lord Julian died before the suit was filed, well, the water remains with Captain Dacre, does it not? And his estate is saved from ruin." Davies stared at her, astonished. "How on earth do you know that?" Miss Marple smiled, a small, knowing expression. "My dear Inspector, one has only to listen to the village postmistress when one goes to buy stamps. She handles all the legal correspondence for the county. People are remarkably careless with what they write on the outside of envelopes, and solicitors are wonderfully indiscreet." Before Davies could formulate a response to this unsettling revelation, a soft, deliberate cough sounded from the open doorway. Chapter 8: The Retainer's Account. Bates the butler entered the library with the silent, gliding motion of a man who has spent 50 years perfecting the art of being present without being noticed. He stood before the desk, his hands clasped firmly behind his back, his posture a monument to a vanishing era of invisible, unquestioning service. His face was a mask of polite non-expression, a face that had seen scandals, affairs, and financial ruin, and had never once betrayed a confidence. He gave his customary small, dry cough, a tiny, mechanical sound, before waiting for the inspector to speak. "Bates," Davies said, trying and failing to sound as authoritative and self-possessed as the elderly butler looked. "We have conflicting reports about your movements in the corridor tonight. Arthur Vance says you took the silver flask from behind a vase of lilies. Captain Dacre says you slipped it covertly to Lady Beatrice. I need the truth." Bates did not blink. His eyes remained fixed on a point just above the inspector's head. "Mr. Arthur is mistaken, sir. And Captain Dacre is highly imaginative in his recollections." "Then what is your account, man? Stop protecting them and tell me what happened." Bates cleared his throat again, a fraction of a second of delay. "It is my duty to maintain order and decorum during these functions, sir. Sir Reginald relies upon me. I noticed the flask early on. It is not seemly for the receiving line to be consuming raw spirits from a pocket flask in full view of the county. I intended to confiscate it quietly and return it to Mr. Arthur later. I observed Miss Eleanor place it behind the lilies on the mahogany side table. So Arthur was telling the truth about that part." "Partially, sir. I did approach the table to retrieve it. However, before I could lay my hand upon it, Captain Dacre reached behind Miss Eleanor and took it for himself." Davies leaned forward, his chair groaning. "Dacre took it? But he swore up and down he didn't touch it. He said he had a sherry." "The captain had finished his sherry, sir. I had just taken his empty glass from him not a moment before. He took the flask with his right hand, opened it, and drank deeply. I was about to intervene and remove it from him, but he then passed it directly to Lady Beatrice, who was conversing with Lord Julian. He passed it to Lady Beatrice," Davies repeated, writing furiously. "Are you absolutely certain?" "Quite certain, sir. I saw the silver clearly." Lady Beatrice took it in her gloved hand, and a moment later she handed it to his lordship. He drank, and the tragic event occurred. Davies sighed, a long, exasperated sound. "So you say Dacre gave it to Beatrice, and Beatrice gave it to Crane?" "Dacre says you gave it to Beatrice. Eleanor says Arthur gave it to Dacre. Arthur says you took it. This is a farce. A complete bloody farce." "It is a house of many shadows, Inspector," Bates said smoothly, his voice betraying no emotion. "And in a draughty corridor, shadows can be highly deceptive." Miss Marple, who had been studying the butler intently, studying the slight tremor in his clasped hands, spoke up. "Bates, how long have you been with the Vance family?" 52 years, madam. Since Sir Reginald was a boy in the nursery. I served his father before him." "You must be very devoted to them." "To Miss Eleanor and Mr. Arthur." "You have watched them grow up." "They are my family, madam," Bates said, and for the first time, a microscopic crack appeared in his professional veneer. A sudden, raw tremor of deep, fiercely protective emotion broke through the flat tone of his voice. "Devotion is a beautiful thing," Miss Marple said softly, her needles clicking. "But it can also be a terrible, heavy burden. Tell me, Bates, when you took Captain Dacre's empty sherry glass, what did you do with it?" Bates hesitated. Only for a fraction of a second, but to Miss Marple, it was as revealing as a written confession. "I placed it on my silver tray, madam, and carried it to the pantry to be washed." "Of course. You are always so meticulous, so careful with your duties." "Thank you, Bates." When the butler had departed, shutting the door silently behind him, Davies looked at Miss Marple in total exasperation. Sherry glasses? What in God's name does a sherry glass have to do with a poisoned hip flask? Everything, Inspector. Everything, Miss Marple said, laying her knitting in her lap. Because if Bates was holding a serving tray with a sherry glass in his left hand, and removing the empty glass from the captain with his right, how could Captain Dacre have taken the flask from the table with his right hand at that exact moment? The timing is wrong. The hands are occupied. Bates is lying. Why? To protect someone, naturally. He is a man who would lie to the devil himself to protect the Vance children. The question is, whom is he protecting? Eleanor? Arthur? Or the reputation of the house itself? We have one witness left, Inspector. Let us see what Lady Beatrice has to say. Chapter 9, The Fiancée's Account. Lady Beatrice drifted into the library like a ghost that had not yet realized it was dead. The heavy oak doors seemed to open and close without her touching them. The hem of her beautiful, exquisitely tailored white silk gown was still horribly stained with the dark, bitter-smelling amber liquid that had fallen from her dying fiancé's hand. Her elbow-length white gloves were slightly wrinkled at the wrists. She sank into the leather chair opposite the inspector, twisting the heavy sapphire engagement ring on her finger so violently, with such frantic desperation, that Miss Marple feared the sharp edge of the stone might cut her skin. Lady Beatrice, Davies said, his usually gruff tone gentling considerably in the face of her obvious distress. I am so deeply sorry for your loss. I know this is a terrible ordeal, but I must ask you about the moments immediately preceding Lord Julian's death. We must establish the truth. Beatrice stared at the fire, her eyes wide, blank, and filled with a horror that seemed to look right through the flames. It happened so fast. It was like a nightmare. One moment he was smiling at the vicar's wife, talking about the spring planting, and the next he was falling. She shuddered, a full-body tremor that shook the chair. Who handed him the flask? I don't know, she whispered, her voice trembling. You don't know? But Captain Dacre and Bates the butler both explicitly state that the flask passed through your hands just before Lord Julian drank. They are lying. Beatrice's voice cracked, rising in a sudden, desperate panic, her composure shattering completely. I never touched it. I wouldn't. Julian hated Arthur's cheap Scotch. He always said it tasted like peat and regret. He would never have drunk it if he knew what it was. He only drank fine cognac. Then who gave it to him? You were standing right next to him. Beatrice closed her eyes, tears leaking from beneath her dark lashes and tracing tracks through her pale makeup. I think it was Bates. Yes, it must have been Bates. He leaned in between us to clear a stray glass from the ledge, and I saw his hand move toward Julian. The silver flashed in the chandelier light. Then Julian had the flask in his hand, and he drank. You are saying the butler handed Lord Julian the poisoned flask? I didn't see it clearly. I just saw the silver flash. And Bates was right there, right beside him. Davies wrote this down, looking profoundly troubled. Lady Beatrice, the flask was passed down the entire receiving line for nearly 20 minutes. Surely you saw it before that precise moment. No. I was paying attention to the guests. I was smiling and shaking hands. I didn't see the flask at all until Julian was holding it and raising it to his mouth. Miss Marple set her knitting gently in her lap. She looked at the young woman, observing the trembling shoulders, the stained silk dress, the heavy sapphire ring, and finally, her gaze settled on the pristine white silk gloves. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, her voice cutting through the tension in the room like a soft chime. "Those are very beautiful gloves. Real silk, I should think. Are they difficult to put on?" Beatrice blinked, thrown completely off balance by the trivial, domestic question. "They are silk, yes. They require some effort. They have tiny pearl buttons at the wrist that are terribly fiddly." "I see. And you have worn them all evening?" "Since before the ball began." "Of course. You did not take them off at any point? Not even to partake of a canapé or a suite in the drawing-room before the receiving line formed?" Beatrice's hand stilled instantly. She stopped twisting the sapphire ring. Her gaze locked onto Miss Marple. Yes. I took the right one off briefly, to eat a small pastry. But I put it back on before the line formed. I buttoned it myself." "Are you quite sure?" "Yes." "Why does it matter?" "My fiancé is dead." "It matters," Miss Marple said, her voice dropping to a murmur that barely carried over the crackle of the fire, yet held the weight of absolute certainty, because when Lord Julian fell, the liquid from the flask splashed violently onto your dress. But I noticed, when I was sitting in the dining room observing the line, that there was a small, dark, damp stain on the index finger of your right glove. A stain that was there before Lord Julian drank. Before he dropped the flask." The silence in the library was absolute, deafening. The fire popped, a sound like a distant, echoing gunshot. Beatrice looked slowly down at her right hand. The glove she wore now was perfectly clean. Pristine white. "Oh, my dear," Miss Marple said sadly. "I was not looking at your glove now. I was looking at it in my memory. The stain is gone now, isn't it? You changed your gloves after the collapse. In the chaos, you went to your room and put on a fresh pair while the inspector was arriving. Because the first pair had a drop of liquid aconite on the fingers." Beatrice opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She stared at Miss Marple with the terrified, wide eyes of a trapped animal realizing the snare has closed. Then, with a heart-breaking sound, she buried her face in her hands and began to sob uncontrollably. The truth had finally broken through the fragile dam of her composure. Chapter 10: The Web Unravels. Seeing the young woman's total collapse, Miss Marple asked Inspector Davies to excuse them for a moment. He hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave a prime suspect alone with a civilian, but the look of quiet, immovable authority in the old woman's eyes brooked no argument. He stepped out, closing the heavy oak door behind him with a soft click, leaving the two women alone in the firelight. Miss Marple did not speak immediately. She moved her chair closer to the weeping girl, the wooden leg scraping softly against the rug. She did not reach out to touch her, she simply sat, a comforting, unyielding presence, the steady click of her knitting needles providing a rhythmic anchor in the emotional storm, while Beatrice cried out her terror, her guilt, and her profound exhaustion. When the sobs finally subsided into ragged, shuddering breaths, Beatrice lifted her head. Her face was ravaged, the beautiful porcelain mask entirely shattered. "He knew," Beatrice whispered finally, her voice muffled and raw. "Julian knew everything. Knew about what, my dear? About the man in London. Beatrice's head snapped up, shock temporarily overriding her despair. How could you possibly know about him? Nobody knows. Because, Miss Marple said softly, pausing her knitting to look the young woman in the eyes, you look exactly like a girl I once knew in St. Mary Mead named Rose Emmett. Rose married the squire's son, a very wealthy, very arrogant young man. But Rose had a secret. She had been secretly married before, when she was very young and foolish, to a scoundrel who deserted her, took her money, but never granted her a divorce. When the squire's son finally found out, he didn't just end the engagement. He threatened to ruin her publicly, to turn her out into the street with nothing, to destroy her reputation so thoroughly she could never show her face again. The fear in your eyes tonight, Beatrice, the desperate, cornered look, it is the exact same fear Rose had. Lord Julian discovered your previous marriage, didn't he? He discovered you were not a widow, but a bigamist. Beatrice nodded, a jerky, broken movement of defeat. My husband. Richard. He is in a sanatorium in Switzerland. Incurable. He doesn't even know his own name. But legally, bindingly, we are still married. Julian hired a private detective to look into my background before the wedding. He found out yesterday. He called me into his study. He was so cold. He smiled. He told me he was going to expose me. Tonight. He was going to stand up at the grand dinner after the receiving line, tap his glass, and announce it to everyone in the county. The fraud. The bigamy. The penniless liar. I would have gone to prison. I would have been utterly destroyed. So you brought the aconite. I took it from the head gardener's locked shed this afternoon while he was at lunch. I knew what it was, I read about it in a botany book in the library. It was meant for the foxes that get into the pheasants. I dissolved it in a little water. I had it in a small glass vial hidden in the pocket of my gown. And the flask? Miss Marple prompted gently. Beatrice drew a shuddering breath, wrapping her arms around herself as if freezing. I didn't plan the flask. I had no idea Arthur was going to bring it. When Arthur left it on the side table behind us, I saw my chance. While Bates was distracted taking Captain Dacre's sherry glass, I reached back and took the flask myself. I turned away slightly, pretending to adjust my dress. Julian was talking to the vicar's wife, distracted. I pulled the cork from the vial with my thumb. That's when a drop of the aconite got on my glove. I uncapped the flask, poured the vial in, and closed it. When Julian turned back to me, smiling that terrible, cold smile, I handed it to him. He was supposed to die, but it was supposed to look like someone else did it. Someone who had the flask before me. Arthur. Or Dacre. Or Eleanor. They all had reason to hate him. Because they all hated him, Miss Marple said. And because you, in your desperation, knew they would all lie to protect themselves, thereby confusing the timeline and making it impossible for the police to untangle. Yes. Beatrice slumped back in the chair, utterly defeated, a broken doll. And they did. They all lied. Arthur lied to protect Eleanor from scandal. Eleanor lied to implicate Dacre because she knows Dacre wanted Julian dead for the water rights and she despises him. Dacre lied to implicate me because he saw me touch it last and wanted to save his own skin. Bates lied to protect the family from ruin. They all lied, and they wrapped me in a web of contradictions I couldn't escape. No, my dear, Miss Marple said gently, her voice full of a profound, sorrowful pity. They wrapped themselves in a web. You were the spider, Beatrice. You spun the silk. But even spiders, when they weave in the dark, get caught in their own webs eventually. Chapter 11: The Firelight Confrontation. Inspector Davies returned to the library after a discreet knock. He took one look at Beatrice's face and knew the case was broken. Lady Beatrice made her confession formally, speaking in a dead, hollow monotone while a police stenographer took down the words that would end her life as she knew it. She spoke without emotion now, the frantic adrenaline of terror replaced by the cold, heavy certainty of ruin. The stolen poison, the stained glove hidden in her bedroom fireplace, the hidden vial, it was all documented, signed, and sealed. When she was finally led away by the sergeant, her white silk dress whispering against the floorboards, the library felt suddenly, oppressively large and silent. Davies sat heavily behind the massive desk. He looked at his notebook, its pages filled with the contradictions, the false statements, and the desperate deflections of the local aristocracy, and shook his head slowly. They all lied, he said, echoing Beatrice's words, his voice thick with disbelief and a weary disgust. Every single one of them. Under oath, to my face, with a dead man lying not 50 feet away. Arthur, Eleanor, Dacre, the butler. They all spun a different, self-serving story. If you hadn't noticed that tiny stain on her glove, Miss Marple, I might have arrested Arthur Vance by morning. His scotch, his flask, his debts. It was the obvious answer. A jury would have hanged him. Murder is rarely obvious, Inspector, Miss Marple said, slowly and methodically packing her knitting away into her worn tapestry bag. When a murder appears obvious, one must always pause and ask who arranged the lighting to make it look so. Lady Beatrice is not a criminal mastermind. She is a desperate woman who relied on a very simple truth, that an unhappy, resentful group of people will naturally act suspiciously when disaster strikes. She counted on the friction between Arthur's debts, Captain Dacre's water rights, and Eleanor's fiercely protective instincts. She knew they would muddy the waters for her, without her even having to ask. Rashomon, Davies muttered, staring into the dying fire. Miss Marple paused, her hand on the clasp of her bag. I beg your pardon. It's a film. Japanese, I think. My wife dragged me to see it in London last year. A terrible crime happens in a forest, and 4 different people tell 4 completely different stories about it to a judge. And you never really know what the truth is, because everyone is lying to protect their own pride. That's what this was. A bloody Rashomon. Ah, Miss Marple smiled, a genuine, warm expression. I am not familiar with the cinema, Inspector. But human nature is exactly the same in a Japanese forest as it is in a drawing room in St. Mary Mead. When people are frightened, they lie. Not always to deceive the law, but to survive the night. But how did you know they were lying? Davies asked. The small things, Inspector. Eleanor claimed Arthur had the flask in his pocket, but Arthur was jingling his coins constantly. One cannot frantically jingle coins in a pocket heavily weighed down by a bulky silver flask. Bates's lie was betrayed by the sherry glass occupying his hands, and you may have noticed he only gave his dry little cough when preparing a fossard. They were all performing. Why? Arthur lied because he thought his sister had finally snapped and poisoned the flask to save him from Julian's influence. Eleanor lied because she thought Arthur had done it in a panic over his debts. Bates lied to protect them both because he views them as his own children. And Captain Dacre lied simply because he is a bully who dislikes women and wanted to shift the blame to the most fragile person in the room. And Beatrice? Davies asked, closing his notebook. Beatrice lied because she was a desperate, cornered woman who believed she had no other choice. A tragic, terrible mistake born of terror. She thought she was silencing a cruel man who intended to destroy her for his own amusement, but she only destroyed herself. Davies stood up, buttoning his damp overcoat and offering his arm to escort her out into the hall. "You have a remarkable eye for detail, Miss Marple. The glove. The timing of the grandfather clock. The butler's sherry glass. How do you do it? How do you see through it all?" Miss Marple took his arm, her step light despite the late hour and the tragedy they had just unspooled. "I do not look at the grand sweeping gestures, Inspector. The shouting matches, the obvious motives, the dramatic accusations. I look at the small things. A dropped stitch in a pattern. A misplaced hairpin. A smudge on a white silk glove. The truth is never found in the grand gestures. The truth is always waiting patiently in the details people think are too small to matter." Chapter 12, The Coda. The Ashdown Hunt Ball was cancelled for the first time in 84 years. The guests went home in a state of shocked, exhilarating gossip, their carriages and motorcars cutting through the cold November night. The great hall was empty now, save for the servants quietly clearing away the untouched canapes and the half-empty glasses of champagne. The grandfather clock ticked steadily, indifferent to the lives it had measured out and the lives it had seen end. Miss Marple stood in the hallway, waiting for her hired car. Eleanor Vance came down the stairs, looking exhausted and strangely fragile without the rigid armor of her social hostility. "Miss Marple," Eleanor said softly. She wasn't touching her earring anymore. "The inspector told me. About Beatrice. And about Julian." "It is over, my dear," Miss Marple said. "We thought Arthur had done it," Eleanor confessed, her voice breaking. "When Arthur brought out the flask, and Julian died. I thought Arthur had finally snapped. Because of the debts. I even pawned my mother's pearls last week to pay his most urgent creditors. I've been wearing these paste imitations, terrified father would notice. I thought Arthur poisoned him for me, so we wouldn't lose Ashdown. And Arthur thought you had done it, to save him," Miss Marple said gently. "A family bound by suspicion, trying to save each other in the dark. It is a very dangerous way to live, Miss Vance." Eleanor looked around the vast, draughty hall. "Perhaps it is time to let it go. The house. The pretenses. All of it." "Perhaps it is," Miss Marple agreed, as the headlights of her car swept across the gravel drive. "Spring cleaning is always difficult, but the air is so much sweeter afterward." She climbed into the car, settled her bag beside her, and watched Ashdown Manor recede into the darkness, its massive stone walls holding the ghosts of 100 old secrets and one new tragedy. The truth is a quiet thing. It doesn't shout. It waits in the shadows, in the dropped stitches and the stained gloves, waiting for someone with the patience to look. And that, friends, is where we close the book on the Ashdown Hunt Ball. The great hall is quiet, the fire has burned down to embers, and the truth has been pulled from the shadows. If this story made you look twice at the people standing next to you in line, or if you've ever found yourself caught in a web of someone else's lies, let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, share this with someone who loves a good firelit mystery, and I'll see you in the next chapter. Until then, keep the doors locked, and watch the quiet ones. Good night.